What could possibly go wrong if you add steam to your oven to get good bread? Doesn't everyone say that it makes bread crispier, larger, and just better? Well, it turns out to be a little more complicated than that. From reduced volume to less crispy bread after baking, there are quite a few things that can go south. And that's what we're going to explore today. Hey, Seraphin here, and imagine a lovely, hot, steamy bath. Not for these adorable snow monkeys, nor for you or me, but for our bread right there in the oven. Steam is used for many different kinds of bread, from the lean artisan bread with a hard crust to the crispy Japanese siopan, and sometimes even in white sandwich breads and burger buns. But what does it actually do, and do you really need it? I've seen too many videos, including my own, where bakers argue over what they think is the best method to add steam to the oven, from lava rocks to ice cubes. But very few stop to think about what steam does, or even if they should add steam. This video is about the science of steam, how it works, how you should use it, and what its downsides are. Because yes, the use of too much steam can also have downsides. Steam is like one of those popular baking methods that everyone likes, but how it really affects bread is something that eludes a lot of people. This is a problem. Because the truth is, steam has a slew of effects on bread baking, which we want to explore today. This video is mainly geared towards home bakers with a regular oven, but all the information can also be applied to a steam oven. We will also be covering how your Dutch oven or pizza stone might be more crucial for baking with steam than you think, so make sure to stick around for that. And naturally, this video is about steam added during the baking of bread, not for making things like steamed buns. So let's get right into it. Bread baking is a dynamic experiment. As any seasoned bread baker knows, there are a lot of things that can affect your bread, including oven temperature, Dutch ovens, and more. But many of the explanations on steam reduce it to an almost one-dimensional factor that only works in a specific way. And this description normally goes something like this. Water evaporates in the hot oven, and as this hot, humid air hits the relatively cooler dough surface, the water vapor condenses. This condensation is magical for the dough's surface. You can think of it like keeping the skin moist and flexible. And as a result, the steam preserves the dough's extensibility and allows it to expand for longer. This is the most popular way that steam is explained. And it's true, but it's only a part of the full picture. And to delve deeper, we need to add a few more details for context. Starting with what happens without steam. In this case, the outer surface of the dough begins to heat up and dry rapidly in the oven, leading to the formation of a stiff shell that can restrict oven rise and even cause the dough to tear uncontrollably. The stiffening of the crust seems to be mainly due to the drying of the outer layer, compared to other factors like starch gelatinization. For example, dough covered in mineral oil continues to expand until 100 degrees Celsius in the oven, while dehydrated dough stops growing much sooner. Mineral oil, which is a popular main ingredient in many baby oils, is fantastic at locking moisture in. So, a bit like the mineral oil, steam keeps the surface of the dough moist, which delays it from setting and drying, allowing the dough to continue rising for longer. However, the steam doesn't just make the dough moist and extensible. In terms of temperature, because the hot steam condenses on the dough, this results in heat absorption by the bread dough. But it also causes a lower crust temperature. After all, water boils at just 100 degrees Celsius. Without the water condensation there, the dough's outer surface would be exposed to much hotter temperatures. In fact, at the temperatures we bake artisan bread at, the dough's outer layer can reach over 120 degrees Celsius in 5 minutes. Whereas as long as there's steam on the surface, the temperature is capped at 100 degrees Celsius. Because of this, adding steam during baking results in a lower heating rate initially at the crust and in the dough overall. This is likely another reason for why steaming the bread dough leads to a higher bread volume, given that the yeast cells are essentially given more time to produce carbon dioxide, extending the oven spring. However, do note though that while more steam was correlated with more carbon dioxide produced by the dough during baking, the paper only found a statistically significant difference between the lowest steaming and the highest steaming. So variations in individual bread doughs may cause more noticeable differences in carbon dioxide production rather than the amount of steam. That being said, it's probably a good idea to be mindful of the proofing time if you're planning to use steam. Erring on the side of less is probably better to prevent an overproofed loaf. There is an important point to note about steam and volume, though. Remember how we talked about the steam condensing on the bread dough and allowing it to remain soft and expand for longer? Well, the caveat to this benefit is that there has to be enough steam for this to happen and improve the bread's volume. In fact, this study found that the largest bread volume was obtained either for high or low steaming. Intermediate amounts of steaming actually resulted in the lowest bread volumes, with the paper explaining that it's probably because there wasn't enough condensation to allow the bread dough to expand. So adding a medium level of steam could result in a very low bread volume compared to adding a high or low amount. To put this into practical use, we can take this Dutch oven for example. Let's say this Dutch oven has a volume of about 5 liters. From the paper, low steaming would use about 1.65 milliliters of water to steam this Dutch oven. That's about a tenth of this ice cube. Medium steaming would call for about 3.3 to 5 milliliters of water, so around a third of this ice cube or a bit less. And for a high amount of steaming, according to this paper, you would need around 6.65 milliliters of water for this Dutch oven or more, which is a little less than half of this ice cube or more. Now, let's not forget that the bread dough will also release steam, and the higher the hydration of your dough, the more steam it releases. So this will also contribute to the total steam in the Dutch oven. The estimations above do not take this into consideration, and on the flip side, the estimations also do not consider the steam lost from adding the ice cube when the Dutch oven is still open. Okay, according to what we just covered, and assuming no leakage, the high steaming amount would result in a voluminous loaf, while medium steaming could result in less volume. Low steaming, on the other hand, could give us bread with a volume comparable to the bread made with high steaming. You might be wondering, but why does low steaming result in a high bread volume then? Well, the explanation for that was thought to be because the bread dough ripped, causing an uncontrolled rise. From the perspective of the study, this was not a good thing because of how it affected the appearance of the bread. But from our perspective, we're probably quite used to seeing something like that, considering that we often rip, aka score, our bread dough. I dare say scoring has a big influence here, and here's why I think you should score your bread when baking with steam and volume is a concern. With low steaming, scoring would help provide a controlled rise, likely reducing other rips and tears in the bread dough. With medium levels of steaming, although the study said that this amount of steaming resulted in less bread volume, I think scoring might actually improve volume, given that the high volume of breads baked with low steaming was attributed to the ripping of the bread dough. If we artificially created a tear in the dough, we could induce more rise in breads baked with intermediate amounts of steam. The only situation where scoring is truly useless is only with high steaming, because the dough will expand and the score will disappear anyways. So to put it simply, if you score your bread dough, you don't want to do high steaming. Keep it at low to medium steaming for most bread recipes. To be fair, scoring would also be detrimental if you score too deeply, disturbing the dough's structure. But this is something that can be easily handled with some practice in scoring properly. This is definitely my own speculation based on my subjective experiences, although I strongly believe it's got a good chance of being true. That being said, the study did not cover the volumes of scored bread doughs baked with steam, so the exact specifics of how that would turn out is still up in the air. But regardless, from what we know now, low steaming may actually be pretty good for bread volume as it turns out. Additionally, we'll see later that there may be a specific reason for why you'd want to avoid very high amounts of steam, the downside I mentioned in this video's opening. But before we get into that, we first need to know more about how steam affects the bread crust. From the appearance of the crust to its texture, steam is very influential. When the dough was baked with more steam, researchers found that the crust had a higher failure force, meaning it was much more brittle and crunchy. Steaming also made the crust glossier in appearance. When divided based on color, the crust-to-crumb ratio went down with an increase in the amount of steaming. Taking it from the paper, this was attributed to a higher internal pressure in the dough for low steaming during oven rise, caused by a faster drying and setting of the outer crust. But when we zoom into the crust microstructure, we can notice more details that explain why we get so many benefits from steaming. With lower steaming, you might see a continuous sheet of clearly visible starch granules, and the crust layer might be thinner. Evidence of starch gelatinization is less apparent. Another paper also shows that at higher baking temperatures and thus higher heating rates, starch gelatinization levels in the crust were lower. So given that we tend to bake artisan breads at over 220 degrees Celsius, that's like a double whammy. With higher steaming, the picture is very different. The moist conditions at the surface promote starch gelatinization, especially at higher amounts of steam. Starch granules become more swollen and deformed, integrated into a gelled structure. This starch paste on the outer layer of the dough will form dextrins and eventually caramelize. Ultimately, it gives us both color and gloss. When we look at the microstructure of this crust further, we can also see that compared to the bread crust with low steaming, the high steaming bread crust has a denser structure. Quoting from the paper, when much steam was applied during baking, bubbles were more elongated with a deformed appearance. It seems that their resistance to expansion was exceeded, and protein starch matrix network was disturbed and broken in several places. Thickness of the dense zone greatly increased. This crust microstructure has a lot to do with the starch gelatinization and jellification from the steam. This dense microstructure influences the fracture behavior of the crust, which is part of why bread baked with steam is so crispy. But that's not the only thing it affects. Now, we can actually talk about one of the downsides of too much steam, which is visible after baking. When the bread is done baking, it shouldn't be surprising that a thicker and denser crust results in less vapor passing through it. In more formal terms, increasing the amount of steam during baking significantly decreases the water vapor transmission rate and water vapor permeability of the bread crust. Now, while a thicker crust with lower permeability might seem beneficial initially by acting as a barrier, looking through these papers suggests a potential downside for crispness retention during storage. A high steaming combined with long baking may result in a thick crust, which, despite being crispier initially, may also act as a barrier for the diffusion of crumb moisture towards the environment, making its crispiness harder to preserve during storage after baking. In short, it doesn't stay crispy for very long. Studies show that at beyond 10% moisture, the crust loses its crispiness. And the main cause of this in bread is moisture redistribution, so water moving from the atmosphere into the crust or from inside the crumb into the crust. With a thicker and denser crust from steaming, the moisture is essentially trapped inside the bread. As a result of this, the paper actually recommended a medium amount of steam to get the benefits of steam while still maintaining a certain level of crispness retention. To add to this, another paper with different methods did find an increase in crispiness retention with a certain amount of starch gelatinization in the crust, due to a rise in cracks and water vapor permeability. But beyond 75% starch gelatinization in the crust, there were no benefits. That being said, this paper studied composite bread doughs without steaming, so it's hard to directly relate the starch gelatinization and crispiness retention to the amount of steam used. We'll talk more about the amount of steam to use later, but I do want to say that crispness retention is a rather complex topic, and while a thinner and more permeable crust would probably let the bread stay crispier for longer, the exact amount of time that the bread stays crispy for also depends on other factors like your room humidity. In a humid place like here, increasing crispiness retention could lead to a shorter overall time that the bread is crispy compared to a place with a drier climate. So when considering crispness retention, make sure to keep this in mind. All right, So now that we know all this about steam, let's talk about how steam affects bread dough along with other baking factors, specifically the oven temperature. To show that, I'd like to bring up another paper looking at steam and its effects on bread. This paper focuses on comparing breads with or without steam baked at two different temperatures, 220 and 240 degrees Celsius. The bread dough that they used was different from the previous studies, which mostly used a lean bread dough with only 4 or 5 ingredients. This paper used a white pan bread with sunflower oil, sugar, and milk powder in its ingredients list, with the dough being baked in a loaf pan. And to make things clear, the researchers used steam at an amount of 0.99 liters per meter cubic, which was classified as an intermediate amount of steam in a previous paper. Based on what we previously covered, showing that intermediate amounts of steam led to lower volumes, it shouldn't be too surprising that the study found that there is relatively more expansion when baking without steaming. But what I'd like to focus on, and the biggest point that we can take from this paper, is how the heating rate of the bread, aka the oven temperature, has a significant impact on it. The paper noted that the top crust of the bread was less thick and presented larger cells when higher heating rate and steaming were performed. And a higher heating rate also increased the size of the gas cells and pores in the crumb of the bread. However, in the case of the crumb, no steaming actually resulted in larger pores and gas cells. This information about the heating rate actually reminds me of how many bakers will actually pair steam with heat-retaining elements in the oven, such as Dutch ovens, pizza stones, and more. Practically speaking, the heating rate isn't solely determined by oven temperature. Just like how we can use oven mitts to pick up a very hot casserole, different materials transfer heat at varying rates. Obviously, things like Dutch ovens and pizza stones are much better at retaining and transferring heat than a thin piece of metal like a regular oven tray. Overall, they make for excellent conductors with enough mass to store a significant amount of heat. Although some say that baking with steam results in a more open crumb, this study would indicate that the heating rate also has at least some influence, which would explain why many bakers have found that using pizza stones or Dutch ovens that transfer and retain heat well improve their bread's quality, at least in terms of getting a more open crumb. From what we know about steam, these heat-retaining elements would be even more important because steam lowers the heating rate of the dough. And of course, this also illustrates the importance of preheating your oven, the vital step in making sure there's enough heat to begin with. But we're not quite done yet with the science. A close-up look at the bread found that with the same amount of steaming, baking the bread at different temperatures, thus different heating rates, resulted in different levels of starch gelatinization in the crust. Higher temperatures and heating rates resulted in less starch gelatinization and a more porous crust surface that is also thinner. Seeing this, we can make a logical speculation that with an increase in baking temperature or heating rate, you need more steam to increase the level of starch gelatinization in the crust. And given that starch gelatinization is tied to the appearance and texture of the crust, this is a pretty important detail. This likely also has something to do with the crispness retention of the bread, as the study found that the water vapor permeability of the bread was raised when it was baked at higher temperatures due to the reduced starch gelatinization. Higher water vapor permeability means longer crispiness retention, so the breads baked with steam at higher temperatures probably stay crispier for longer. Again, this could be something that us bakers have somewhat picked up on when baking breads with both steam and heat-retaining elements, which might result in a better impression of the breads baked in this way. Of course, the full effects of heating rate on bread dough are likely more complex than just what I've mentioned. But from what we've seen so far, the heating rate and the amount of steam seem to be connected factors influencing bread baking. All right, so now that we know all this about steam, its effects, and how other factors can influence the bread dough along with steam, let's summarize everything and try to apply it to our bread dough. First off, steam is generally your friend in the oven. That being said, while high steam gives great volume, low steam also results in a surprisingly large loaf, and intermediate amounts of steam actually result in lower volume. Of course, if you score your bread dough, it's advisable to avoid baking with high amounts of steam. As explained before, low and medium steam levels yield better results. This is something I have subjectively seen myself, especially when using small containers like a Dutch oven. When I add too much steam to such a small vessel, it always results in a more voluminous, glossy, and earless loaf. So you should make sure to consider your baking conditions when trying to determine how much more steam you should add. More on this a little later. Okay, for now, let's talk about the crust. More steam generally results in more starch gelatinization on the surface, and if you look close up, a denser crust. Think of it as creating this amazing starch paste that then gets all toasty, creates dextrins, and caramelizes. The result? That beautiful glossy sheen, gorgeous light color, and a wonderfully brittle, crispy crust that we all crave. However, there is a downside to steam, especially for too long. Initially, it might seem like peak crispiness, but there's a catch. That dense crust acts like a barrier. It prevents moisture that's trying to escape from the crumb as the bread cools and sits. So your gloriously crispy crust can turn disappointingly soft much faster during storage. Of course, steam is only one element of baking, and there are many other things that can influence the final bread. Heating rate is a huge player here, influencing the crust properties and crumb pretty significantly. I speculate that's why so many of us swear by our Dutch ovens or baking stones. They provide intense, consistent heat, which when paired with steam often give us a good quality bread. High heating rates or a higher oven temperature lower starch gelatinization on the surface of the crust, which increases the porosity and water vapor permeability of the crust, probably increasing the crispiness retention of it. Generally speaking, when baking bread in an oven with a higher temperature, you probably have to add more steam to get the same effect as if you bake the bread with a lower temperature. The heating rate also affects the porosity of the bread. A higher heating rate results in larger cell size and porosity in the crumb, as well as in the crust. With that, let's now talk about the amount of steam you should use. If you were to add steam to a regular oven, you might find that your bread ends up pretty differently. There's a pretty big chance that a lot of the steam will escape from the oven, resulting in a lower steaming scenario even if you're using a lot of water. This is probably why many steaming guides will call for large amounts of water when you're trying to steam your entire oven. If you're simply covering the bread dough or using something like a Dutch oven, then it gets a lot easier given the smaller volume. For a high hydration dough, you might not even have to add any water. The steam that the bread dough releases will be trapped inside the Dutch oven or underneath the pan and will serve its purpose. For a low hydration dough, a small ice cube or even just spraying the dough could work. You do require some trial and error, most likely, to get everything just right. Generally speaking, it will be very clear from the glossiness of the crust alone whether or not you have added a high or low amount of steam. As a side note, you might also be curious about what happens if you spray water on the dough. And while there aren't any papers on this, I think it's safe to say that it would probably result in shorter-lived steam-like effects. The water sprayed on the dough would probably slow down the heating rate of the dough, increase starch gelatinization, but a lot of it would quickly evaporate, especially if you're not using something to cover the dough. All right, we've covered the complete science of steam today, looking at both the pros and cons, as well as the practical implications of how to use it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a comment below. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!